Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are going to hear about a radical feminist perspective on historical women's writing, including George Elliot, and it's being discussed by Kate Newey. So thank you so much to Kate for speaking about this, and thanks very much for everybody for coming to listen. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks everyone for being here, and for having me. Uh, I sort of suggested this topic because I've done a few of these webinars where I've talked about particular things I've been researching, and I thought it might be interesting to go back to some of the really foundational radical feminist texts of literary criticism, and the way that they use literature. And so for the first half of this talk, as long as I don't go on for too long, I'm going to talk about some of the really formative texts that came out of the 1960s and the radical feminist activism of the second wave, and how they fed through into academic literary scholarship that was very much predicated on feminist activism. And looking at this list, Kate Millet's Sexual Politics, Elaine Showalter, A Literature of Their Own, Ellen Moore's Literary Women, and Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, The Mad Woman in the Attic. Those last three books are all about mostly about fiction, about women's writing, generally starting in the late 18th century and going through to the present, or focusing on the 19th century. And I was really intrigued by what's happening in the 19th century. I'm a scholar of the 19th century, and the Showalter, Moores, and Gilbert and Gubar were books I read during my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. So they're really very formative. But I thought I'd go back to Kate Millet's Sexual Politics. Um, oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Before I go into that, just to say that what happened from this sort of flowering, this real kind of exponential increase in feminist, really specifically feminist scholarship in the late 60s and 70s, was that there's been this really, over the last 40 years, it's hard to think, it is over 40 years, um, this focus on 19th century women's writing has led to gradual but now quite significant changes in school and university curricula. Also, the reprinting of, as it were, lost texts by women in places like Virago Press, for example, finding um, books by women and reprinting them. And there's this canon of women's writing, which has expanded from, say, Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, and George Eliot into, I was trying to think of the list of, just off the top of my head, 19th century writers, mostly novelists, who are now widely taught and widely read. And last week, I was in attendance at a conference in Birmingham of the Victorian Popular Fiction Association. And these writers were the focus. They also run a series of books about popular women writers of the 19th century. And, the conference had about, I guess, about 80 people there, academics, but also people whose general interest is the, popular fiction of the 19th century. But the whole conference has a particularly female-centered and generally feminist, the two aren't the same, approach. And I just was thinking about this webinar, preparing this webinar, and really reflecting on that change over the last 40 years. And it's just useful to do whenever one gets down in the dumps about, the battles that we still have to fight, and the current battle about the very definition of what it is to be a woman and women's spaces. And so these scholars give us, I think, the tools to start thinking about women's spaces as imaginative and metaphoric, as well as physical and material. So, what's really interesting is that one of the kind of texts of second wave feminism, if you like, Kate Millet's book Sexual Politics, and I know there's been a webinar on that here at WGI in the past, so I'm not going to spend too long talking about that. But what's really interesting about this book, and I think it was her PhD thesis, if I'm correct, is that she spends quite a bit of time, talking about writing. And she opens with talking about basically the representation of rape in fiction. Um, and you know, I mean, her book is a hard read, actually. Her quotations from works of fiction that she offers us as, you know, examples of the way that patriarchy is structured and the way that patriarchy persists and reproduces itself. But then she goes on to talk about what she calls, as I say here on this slide, the first sexual revolution of 1830 to 1930. And she starts to talk about the various theories for the origins of patriarchy. And she goes through the sort of psychosexual and so on and so forth. But she actually dismisses it all in saying so much, and I've quoted here, if you can see it. So much for the evanescent delights afforded by the game of origins. The questions are about, you know, whether patriarchy originated from primordial male superior strength or a later mobilization of such strength under certain circumstances appears at the moment to be unanswerable. It's also probably irrelevant to contemporary patriarchy, where we are left with the realities of sexual politics, grounded, we're often assured, on nature. But she goes on really to talk about the fact that the kind of persistence of patriarchy and sexual difference, the distinction between the sexes in the more significant areas of role and temperament, not to mention status, have in fact essentially cultural rather than biological basis, which I think is really interesting. But she then finishes this chapter by saying, by an oversight too conspicuous to be accidental, historical accounts have ignored the issue of sexual revolution, dismissed it as a frivolous footnote intending to demonstrate the folly of votes for women, or mistaken it for a trivial exhibitionist ripple in sorry, my screen is slightly obscured. Here we are. In sexual fashion. Yet the great cultural change which made with the beginnings of the sexual revolution represent is at least as dramatic as the 4 or 5 other social upheavals in the modern period to which historiographical attention is zealously devoted. And I thought that was a really important statement about the women's movement as one of the great social upheavals of particularly Western history. So, the first book I want to have a look at in picking up the challenge, in a sense, that Millet throws down is a book by Elaine Showalter called A Literature of Their Own. And I was looking to see whether the works of scholarship that I'm citing are available in kind of library or downloadable digital copies. And I found that this was available through JSTOR, which is a digital platform. It is sometimes password protected, but you can get access through most local libraries will have access rights, and certainly big, if you're anywhere near a big deposit library like the British Library or any big city library in Manchester or Leeds and so on, they will have access. What Showalter is trying to do is identify what might be a literature of their own. And she writes that there's a difference between books that happen to have been written by women and a female literature. And she's actually referring here to discussions, again, in the 19th century. And in fact, a lot about one of the primary literary critics of the 19th century, George Henry Lewes, who was George Elliot's common law husband. You know, they had this famously, they ran away together. Lewes was already married. divorce was difficult, and he had, I think, accepted his wife's infidelity to the extent that a divorce on the grounds of infidelity would not have been allowed by the law of the time. Anyway, so he's very attuned to what might be a female literature because he's one of those very rare men who basically hothouses George Elliot to write the way she writes. He's not entirely uncontroversial, I think, as a kind of, a possible feminist ally. But anyway, he does say to Charlotte Bronte that the novel is the best form for women because they're inevitably confined by their domestic circumstances, and the novel is an ideal art form that allows them to explore their own knowledge and experience of domesticity through an art form. Um, but what Showalter is teasing at and setting up as a problem or an issue is, as you can see here in this quotation, that it was difficult for women to find the kind of community to enable them to define themselves as women writers. As Showalter puts it, women writers have very infrequently considered whether these experiences might transcend the personal and local to assume a collective form in art and reveal a history. And as I go through all of this work, we'll see that this difficulty is perennial, and both artists of the 19th century and scholars and critics of the 19th century keep coming back to this issue. And I must say, when I teach this material to students, I get them to do a project where they have to go back to archival sources, what women wrote in the 19th century or any time in the past, really. I allow them, they go back to these primary sources. And one group last year said to me, I thought they were very perspicacious. They said, what we noticed is they were working across 3 centuries of women's work in the theatre. And they said, what we noticed is that the same problems that these women had to deal with in the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, they come up against the same problems. Um, so, and what Showalter also points out, and remember, this is 1977, so she's researching and writing in the early, in the first half of the 1970s, in that early moment of rediscovery of women's work and women's culture in the second wave of women's liberation. She points out in looking at, for example, the idea of utopia, that women use utopia, as she says, they weren't visions of primary womanhood free to define its own nature and culture, but flights from the male world to a culture defined in opposition to the male tradition. Typically, the feminist utopias are pastoral sanctuaries where a population of pre-lapsarian Eves cultivate their organic gardens, cure water pollution, and run exemplary childcare centres, but do not write books. And what Showalter is saying here is the question of art in liberation in the 19th century and in past historical women's writing has often been difficult and problematic, that there's a lot of other work that women feel they need to do before they can get to art. But I think what all these feminist literary critics are trying to point us to is that art might be the way into thinking about liberation. And I think this is why, going back to Millett, I think that she's using writing and art really interestingly as political documents. Now, I think nowadays we take this for granted, certainly in universities, and it's gone awry in certain respects. But these are very new ideas in the 1970s. And they had to, I can remember some of the battles in the university department where I did my PhD, in thinking about, well, can we really talk about a woman's literature, was what some of the older male professors would say. And that was the 1980s. So, Showalter goes on to talk about this renewed enthusiasm for an idea of a special female self-awareness. And that's, she's quoting Patricia Mayer Spack's The Female Imagination. Um, and she notes this interdisciplinary effort at a kind of systematic history of women's work and women's writing, women's art, or cultural production more generally. But and I mean, I think it's really interesting to go back to some of these texts after 40 years to see just what a huge project this was. And I'm sure I'm not looking at the chat at the moment, but I'm sure in the chat, people are saying, well, why isn't she talking about this book or this book or this book? You know, we all have our favorite and formative books from this period that we maybe read, and they kind of structured the way that we think about this huge, broad project of rediscovery of women's writing, women's art, women's work over, you know, the last 300 or 400 years, let alone the last 4 decades. Um, so this is also Showalter saying that actually, as a scholar, she would rather think about women's writing as the female literary tradition as a subculture, like any other literary subculture. And I think this is something we can argue with. She's very wary of talking about a women writers movement, particularly in the period she's looking at, which is from the Bronte sisters to uh, um, to Lessing. And I can see her point, but a couple of the other scholars I'm going to look at actually shift. And it's really interesting to see these shifts. Often the work of a pioneer like Elaine Showalter is basically just to bring this work to our attention and to suggest that there might be a consideration of the material circumstances in which women are writing, which might frame and direct the kinds of writing they do. And I think that's what she means by a literary subculture. The way, as she says here, any minority group finds its direction of self-expression relative to a dominant society. And she also poses that problem. Each generation of women writers has found itself, in a sense, without a history, forced to rediscover the past anew, forging again and again the consciousness of their sex. And I think sometimes when I reflect, I was having a conversation indeed at this Victorian popular fiction conference I was at earlier this week. Someone said to me, "Oh, you know, I don't believe in all this, you know, a man can be a woman stuff." But she said to me, "Where did it all start?" You know, and again, I think this question, where did this particular problem we're facing now start? This sort of sense of we're losing our history and we need to keep going back to our history. So my favorite book of this lot that I'm looking at is this wonderful book by Ellen Moores, Literary Women. And it is I can't really do it justice because it's a whistle-stop tour through writing from the late 18th century. And she really does say there is a women's literary culture. And she talks about women's writing in terms of the epic, the Gothic, and the Romantic. And I think she really, of all writers, really picks up on the Gothic. And I know, again, one of the interesting things about teaching some of this material to 20, 21-year-olds today, and I've said before on these webinars, young women today are hungry for this material. And they're really interested in the Gothic. The number of essay proposals that I get that they want to talk about the Gothic and the way that women use the Gothic. The other thing that Moores does is to talk about this concept of heroinism. My spell checker kept kept reverting this to heroin, which is a kind of unfortunate sort of AI mistake. But Moores really coins this term, and I think it's a really useful term because what it does, whereas Showalter is sort of posing the issues and the problems for women's writing, what Moores does is take this notion of the heroine and turn it into the idea of heroinism, about the way that women blast through literary conventions, and the women she focuses on as writers and the kind of writing they do is writing that tends to blast through the conventions of their time. So she starts with, I think, still one of our literary mothers, Mary Wollstonecraft, and she says, take someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, if there ever was anyone else like Mary Wollstonecraft, which I think is a wonderful kind of, acknowledgement of Wollstonecraft's power and foresight. And she quotes from Wollstonecraft's really important book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And I keep coming back to this book again. I know there's been a webinar on that, and I think it's just a wonderful book. But she also talks about the way that earlier than Wollstonecraft's essay of Vindications of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft is writing fiction. And she focuses on Wollstonecraft's preface to her novel Mary, a fiction, and it's a Gothic fiction. In delineating the heroine of this fiction, the author attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. And so what Showalter is pointing out is that Mary Wollstonecraft here is defining herself as a self-consciously making art. She's not saying, oh, I just happened to write this little sort of, Jane Austen's little portraits on 2 inches of ivory. Mary Wollstonecraft is declaring, I'm a novelist. I'm making stuff up. It's not me. And at one of the concluding paragraphs of this chapter on Gothic heroinism is the way in which, when women are trying to find, as Moores says here, a heroic structure for the female voice in literature, that they encounter an order of reality, perhaps more intractable than social fact, the literary, matters of literary form. And she goes on to talk about matters of readership, matters of inspiration, and matters of language. And this final sentence, those dreadful sexist little words, the pronouns, have always bedeviled the English writer at moments of heightened awareness that I, the author, is a she. And that consciousness all the time that women are writing as women, when perhaps they just want to write as writers, is something that I think all of these critics, and indeed women in the 19th century, struggled with. And it's, again, one of these problems that women artists keep having to deal with in their own work and their reflections on the more broadly, how they might fit into this amazing tradition of women's cultural production, women's art. Right. My last, before I get into George Eliot, which is kind of to sort of illustrate the way that Eliot is trying to deal with some of these issues, my last kind of landmark critical work is this huge book. It's over 700 pages long. Even in the paperback, it's a really massive doorstop that was published in the late 70s, but obviously is being written over this whole decade. And it was always known when I was an undergraduate and then as a postgraduate as, oh, Gilbert and Gubar say, Gilbert and Gubar. In the way that my students will throw, or Butler says in terms of Judith Butler, I've started to say, yeah, Butler's really interested in gender. I don't think she's a feminist, though. And that kind of makes them stop. But anyway, Gilbert and Gubar had made, I think, really, in a way, sum up some of the the innovation, the originality, the true courage that a lot of this scholarship was demonstrating across the 1970s. Um, and also, whereas Showalter is very cautious about saying, I don't think there's I'm not sure there's a female imagination. They, in this landmark of feminist literary criticism, they want to talk about a feminist poetics. So they are really taking that, that bull by the horns, cow by the horns, and saying, yes, there is something we can talk about that is a distinctive school of women's writing, but it's formed by the ways in which women have to work within patriarchy. So in a way, there's kind of, that we're seeing this journey from Millet's definition of patriarchy through Showalter's very cautious, let's look at a female literary tradition, let's rediscover what these women were writing. Moore's trying to really pull out the kind of heroism of both fictional characters and their authors, to Gilbert and Gubar saying, no, we can really say there's something going on here. And you can see why that the study of the 19th century literary imagination, their subtitle, became so influential. I heard them speak at an event run by, if anyone's in the beautiful north, around the Keighley district, the Bronte Museum there in Haworth runs a kind of summer literary festival, and they ran it online. They have some things online that you can it's a paid for kind of thing. And they did have Gilbert and Gubar speaking about, the Mad Woman in the Attic, or 40 years on, um, uh, about what are the new areas in women's writing. And inevitably, uh, given the kind of state of affairs in the United States at the moment, they're America. These are all American texts. They were talking about, issues of race and racial politics, and inevitably they mentioned the kind of new worlds of kind of queer and trans studies, which, is inevitable at the moment in scholarship, sadly. Anyway, um, so they start, and I'm really just going to give an essence of the book. I wanted to quote some of their writing because it is a distinctive book. Their sentences go on forever with all of these clauses in apposition. But there's an energy to the writing which is extraordinary. And I was rereading it yesterday on a very long train journey. And I did think, wow, no wonder this really took us all with them. Um, they start with a citation. They basically start with, is the pen a penis? That question. And they give a whole lot of literary quotation of all these men writing in the 19th century, basically saying, yeah, there's a link between not just patriarchy in writing, but what they call the metaphor of literary paternity. And they say all, and they, it's several 5 pages, and then they get to this paragraph. All seem overwhelmingly to agree that a literary text is not only speech quite literally embodied, but also power mysteriously made manifest, made flesh. The words of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, just ripple through this whole book. Not that it's a religious book at all. In many ways, it's kind of showing what women are writing against. In patriarchal Western culture, therefore, the text's author is a father, a progenitor, a procreator, an aesthetic patriarchy whose pen is an instrument of generative power like his penis. More, his pen's power, like his penis's power, is not just the ability to generate life, but the power to create a posterity to which he lays claim. In this respect, the pen is truly a mighty than its phallic counterpart, the sword, and in patriarchy, more resonantly sexual. So again, this idea of history, posterity, how can women, be part of this? And in fact, this is the question they ask: with what organ can females generate texts? So they really pose this question about the anxiety of women writers. How are they part of a tradition? And thinking about the 19th century, where in the West, in English writing, um, to be Christian was normative and assumed, as was heterosexuality. Heteronormativity and Christian normativity were assumed. I think it's interesting that both these writers come from a Jewish scholarship background. And I think that really also kind of mediates why they're so interested in these kind of ground zero texts, if you like. So this anxiety, what if the male generative power is not just the only legitimate power, but the only power there is? So I'm jumping, and I'm going to just, because I want to get on to George Elliot in the last 20 minutes. But they then explore that question through Virginia Woolf's notion of killing the angel in the house. And the angel in the house is the title of a poetry cycle by a late 19th, I think 1860s, 1870s poet called Coventry Patmore, who writes a poem called The Angel in the House. And Virginia Woolf writes this very famous essay about the only way to be a woman writer is to kill the angel in the house. But she then goes on to say, okay, I've killed the angel in the house. What now? And Gilbert and Gubar take that up, and they then move into thinking about folklore and fairy tales and the opposite of the angel, which is the monster. And they posit that women writers are caught between Snow White and the Wicked Queen, the angel and the monster. And that one of the kind of conditions of the female imagination, that thing that Showalter is trying to resist, is that women writers, women artists, either very inclined to immobilize themselves with suffocating tight laces in the glass coffins of patriarchy, or they are tempted to destroy themselves by doing fiery and suicidal tarantellas out of the looking glass. So Snow White and the Wicked Queen, but also Nora in A Doll's House, Henrik Ibsen's play, does a tarantella. That's one of these turning points in the play. Hedda Gabler commits suicide, you know. Yet, despite the obstacles presented by those twin images of angel and monster, despite the fears of sterility and the anxieties of authorship from which women have suffered, generations of texts have been possible for women writers. And this is the final paragraph of this first chapter. By the end of the 18th century, and here is the most important phenomenon we will see throughout this volume, women were not only writing, they were conceiving fictional worlds in which patriarchal images and conventions were severely, radically revised. And as self-conceiving women from Anne Finch and Anne Elliot to Emily Bronte and Emily Dickinson rose from the glass coffin of the male-authored text as they exploded out of the Queen's looking glass, the old silence dance of death became a dance of triumph, a dance into speech, a dance of authority. And I think it's really interesting that at the end of the 70s, when we move into the 1980s and, you know, those populist notions of girl power and so on, we have a scholarly text that is exhorting this dance into speech, dance of authority. I also wanted to give you a sense of the way that Gilbert and Gubar write. I mean, there's 700 pages of this, and it's exhilarating and sometimes very irritating, but I really recommend, you know, if you want a bit of kind of reminder of what this is all about, that book is a fantastic book to dip in and out of. And it doesn't really have, it's not literary scholarship in that very detailed, oh, now we're going to do a close reading of this paragraph to pull out the meanings. It really races through lots and lots of writing and gives you a sense of the expansive nature of women's kind of poetics and the women's feminist imagination. So the last sort of 20 minutes, I wanted to use George Eliot as a way of kind of showing one of the, central canonical women writers of the 19th century. And, if Virginia Woolf says we should all writers, all women should rain down rose petals on Aphra Behn's grave. She was the first professional woman writer. The other thing that Virginia Woolf says, and I always think, Virginia Woolf's always worth going back to, is that George Eliot's novel Middlemarch was the only novel written for grown-ups. I'm not going to talk about Middlemarch. I could win a gold medal for talking about Middlemarch, but at the Talking Olympics. But I want to look at a couple of essays that Eliot wrote during almost her apprenticeship of as a writer in the 1850s. And it's when she was living with George Henry Lewis. One of the things, and this is Ellen Moores writes about the creation of Marianne Evans into George Eliot. And one of the things Ellen Moores talks about is the way that George Henry Lewis got George Eliot, he and George Eliot sat down and read Jane Austen out loud, all her novels. And obviously, George Eliot is not Jane Austen, but I think that's a really interesting kind of insight into the way that George Eliot is reading herself into a tradition of women's writing. George Henry Lewis was also quite an advisor to Charlotte Bronte, although, I mean, incredibly patronizing to her as well, quite frankly. And there's a really interesting thing. I haven't got time to go into this, but Charlotte Bronte is provincial, regional, Yorkshire. George Eliot and George Henry Lewis are part of this sort of cosmopolitan London scene. Although George Eliot was always really clear to her female friends that because she was living with Lewis without marriage, she was always very understanding if they did not want to come to her house to meet her, because that could have reflected on their respectability as well as hers. Anyway, she becomes the assistant editor and reviewer for the Westminster Review, which, as you can see from my slide, was founded by Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, edited at one point. It's this kind of really central sort of place for radical London. And I want to look at two review essays. One is a review essay of Margaret Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century. And this is actually not for the Westminster Review. It's for another radical journal called The Leader. And she starts the essay, and this is Eliot's writing here on the screen, by saying that she wants to compare Fuller's writing, and Margaret Fuller was an American feminist. I don't know enough about her. I imagine some people on this webinar will know a lot more than I do about Margaret Fuller. But she starts to compare Fuller with Mary Wollstonecraft. And what I find really fascinating is that she's one of the few women writers of the 19th century to talk openly about Mary Wollstonecraft. And again, Mary Wollstonecraft was not talked about, probably because Wollstonecraft herself lived with William Godwin I mean, they were married just before Wollstonecraft's death. But again, there's this sort of sense of that veil of unrespectability over these two women. Eliot's reason, she thinks, for what she calls the vague prejudice against the rights of women, as in some or other way a reprehensible book, thinks that it's because it's eminently serious, severely moral, and withal rather heavy, that when she's writing in the 1850s, no edition has been republished since 1796, which really shocked me. I mean, now, it's in a Penguin paperback. You can get it online in a digital edition, obviously, but that between 1796 and 1856, what's that, 60 years, there's no reprinting is quite extraordinary, really, and goes back to Millett's argument that, you know, historiography here, what people think is worthy of history, is the villain here, and that's patriarchy again. So Elliot often writes in ways that to a contemporary, you know, and I'm aware this is a radical feminist kind of view on all of this material. It's not comfortable reading for a radical feminist or a revolutionary feminist. Elliot is not like Wollstonecraft saying, you know, women's rights need to be considered alongside men's rights, and a vindication of the rights of women, the Wollstonecraft text that Elliot is referring to throughout this essay, is an answer to Thomas Paine's A Vindication of the Rights of Men, you know, and this is all just after the French Revolution, 1789 and so on. But what Elliot is really negotiating here, I think, is the problem that all the literary critics I've talked about keep coming back to, which is how these women are writing within patriarchal notions of femininity, you know, within what we might now call gender roles, what is probably safer to call sex-based stereotypes or sex-based roles, that idea of the construction of femininity as cultural and historical rather than of nature, which is what Millett is saying as well, really. So what Elliot is really interested in, both Margaret Fuller and Mary Wollstonecraft, is the education of women and the way that the ignorant and feeble-minded women, to quote Eliot's words here, actually has a deleterious impact on men, but indeed society as a whole. And this is a huge theme if you've read Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She's sort of saying, because women run the home and raise children, they must be educated. We can't live with these frivolous, you know, women who are only interested in dresses and fashion and so on. Women need to be educated in order to improve the whole of society. It's kind of the argument that we accept nowadays, but, you know, it's a little over 100 years since women were admitted to degrees at universities. And in this country, at least, we're still not marking 1928 is 3 years off when women were considered to be fully civil subjects. So I think Eliot's very acute about pulling out some of these enduring and ongoing issues about the way that patriarchy infantilizes women and how that's bad for women, but it's also bad for entire society. And she's kind of very clear that men who prefer stupid, uneducated women are actually the weaker men. And she goes on to say, for our own parts, we see no consistent or commodious medium between the old plan of corporal discipline and that thorough education of women, which will make them rational beings in the highest sense of the word. And again, I think that, yes, this is her idea, but also her writing here gives you a sense of how she's negotiating between the kind of radical sexist misogyny within which this essay is being published and her own desire to make space for women and for women's writing, to make space for the acceptance of women as rational beings. And she goes on to say, and again, I think what she really gets really well at the end of this essay is this double bind that women are caught in, the patriarchal contradiction. That is the theme that runs through all the women's writing I've talked about this morning, the scholars as well as Elliot herself. On one side, we hear a woman's position can never be improved until women themselves are better. And on the other, that women can never become better until their position is improved, until the laws are made more just and a wider field open to feminine activity. There is a perpetual action and reaction between individuals and institutions. We must try and mend both little by little and little, the only way in which human beings can be mended. And then she goes on to make an argument that might seem to be contradictory, that might seem to say women's rights, women's equality with men is not the thing we should be arguing for. So this is this slide. She says that if you want to assert women's equality or indeed their moral superiority to men, then what you're saying is that even though women are subjected, enslaved, in bondage, they're still morally superior. So why do you need equal rights? Because you're already morally superior without those equal rights. That's really what she's saying in the first half of this paragraph, I think. But she then goes on to say, but we want freedom and culture for women because subjection and ignorance have debased her, and with her man. And this is always Eliot's argument, that men and women, we need to see them as moving, progressing together. For if she be small, slight-natured, miserable, how shall men grow? Both Margaret Fuller and Mary Wollstonecraft have too much sagacity to fall into this sentimental exaggeration. And this is Eliot's final sentence and final judgment here. Their ardent hopes of what women may become do not prevent them from seeing and painting women as they are. And I think that's really central to Eliot's. I don't know that she would have seen herself as a feminist in our terms, but it's central to Eliot's notion of how women might be liberated, might be free to grow. And this idea that women might be free to grow and that they need to be rational beings is central to a really famous essay that I'm going to finish on by Elliot called Silly Novelists by Lady Novelists. And most of the essay, and you can get it all on the George Elliot archive, and I've got a final slide with the links there. But if you just Google George Elliot archive, all of these writings will come up downloadable for free. Silly Novels by Lady Novelists is a very extended review essay that goes through a bunch of novels, which actually I was thinking there's a project there to sit down and reread all these novels that she's read. And she goes through all these different types of silly novels. And you're thinking, oh dear, why is she being so, why is she being so anti-sisterhood and so on? But it's a rhetorical ploy to move towards an understanding of precisely that, looking for and aspiring to writing and art that is coming from rational beings. And she's really wanting to say that if we tell one lady novelist after another that they hail her productions with delight, if we puff, if we overpraise, pictures of life are brilliant, their characters are well drawn, their style fascinating, their sentiments lofty, what that does is that it diminishes women. It overpraises them in ways that actually demonstrate how of little value these novels are seen to be. And she goes on to say, and in a way that diminishes women's writing, overpraising bad writing is not good for developing good writing by women, really, is her argument. She goes on to say, no sooner does a woman show that she has genius or effective talent than she receives the tribute of being moderately praised and severely criticized. And I've seen letters in various collections of other far less famous women writers saying exactly this. As soon as people know I'm a woman, they stop judging the writing from writing and they judge me as a woman. And I am severely criticized as a woman. And I think Elliot is making a really good point here about the frustration for women artists. By a peculiar thermometric adjustment, when a woman's talent is at zero, journalistic approbation is at the boiling pitch. When she attains mediocrity, it is already at no more than summer heat. And if ever she reaches excellence, critical enthusiasm drops to the freezing point. And I think that this is actually what goes on still today. In the desire to work out what is good, so these sex-based stereotypes are never far from particularly male critics' judgment. They just can't help themselves. She goes on to say, Harriet Martineau, Currer Bell, that is Charlotte Bronte, and Mrs. Gaskell have been treated as cavalierly as if they had been men, which is a good thing in George Eliot's view. And every critic who forms a high estimate of the share women may ultimately take in literature will, on principle, abstain from any exceptional indulgence towards the productions of literary women. And she wants to she's really all the time wanting to talk about women's intellectual power, but that it is always bound up, unfortunately, with the questions of these sort of sex-based stereotypes of femininity. For it must be plain to everyone who looks impartially and extensively into feminine literature that its greatest deficiencies are due hardly more to the want of intellectual power than to the want of those moral qualities that contribute to literary excellence and patient diligence, a sense of the responsibility involved in publication, and an appreciation of the sacredness of the writer's art. Now, Eliot's argument isn't that women can't do this. It's that they are given this false impression. Here's the argument. The false impression that to write at all is a proof of superiority in women. And it's this double bind that she's identifying and analyzing. That when women are pushed into, oh, isn't that nice? A little woman is clever enough to write a novel. We are not seeing the really true power of women's writing. On this ground, she says, we believe that the average intellect of women is unfairly represented by the mass of feminine literature, and that while the few women who write well are very far above the ordinary intellectual level of their sex, the many women who write ill are very far below it. Now, this is really interesting when you think that Eliot is not writing fiction at this point, although she's planning to. It's almost her sort of manifesto for the way that she wants to write. The standing apology for women who become writers without any special qualification is that society shuts them out from other spheres of occupation. And she goes on to talk about the problem of women writing from vanity, because what it does is it puts women's work into this box of silly novels, of what she talks about as busy idleness. And this is the final paragraph. And I think it's still, you can hear from my pausing of this, it's still a very difficult essay to get your head round if you want to think about George Eliot as, one of these great heroines of a kind of female literary tradition. But I think if we really deal with the very hard argument she's making, there is something so antiseptic in the mere healthy fact of working for one's bread that the most trashy and rotten kind of feminine literature is not likely to have been produced under such circumstances. In all labor, there is profit. What she's saying here is that writing and art are hard work, and that that's what women need to adhere to. That in fact, then they're doing themselves and other women a disservice by writing these sort of fashionable novels. And that actually what we should be valuing is this labor and the thinking, moral kind of, and by moral I think she really means ethical kind of consideration of the world around. And that's what, and I'll finish here, I think that's my yeah, this is this is her final paragraph. She says, evidence that women can produce novels not only fine, but amongst the very finest novels that have that precious speciality lying quite apart from masculine aptitudes and experience. Like crystalline masses, and this is the novel, it may take any form and yet be beautiful. We have only to pour in the right elements, genuine observation, humor, and passion. And that's her final paragraph in this essay. And I think she's writing a manifesto there for great writing by women, and also a manifesto for her own writing. And if you're familiar with George Eliot's novels, what you'll know about them is that they are these very detailed accounts of life of the middle orders, of life of the working and middle classes in regional, rural Britain, or apart from Romola, perhaps, and Daniel Deronda, where she's really concerned to think about what she talks about very early on. If I can go back to the essay in Margaret Fuller, here we are. There is perpetual action and reaction between individuals and institutions. We must try and mend both by little and little, the only way in which human things can be mended. And I think that's where her fictional writing lands, and that's where I will stop. And I think I don't know if there's any burning questions coming out of the chat, but thank you so much for listening. And I think that, yeah, I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people saying, how the study of English literature starts to really open up these issues. And I think we need to keep on saying that women's writing is really essential for understanding women's history, but also women's liberation and how we might go forward. Because I think the women scholars I was looking at and the writing of the period they're looking at kind of give us heart in difficult times. I'll stop there.
Okay, can you stop sharing so
Yeah.
we can see you?
Oh, yes.
It's
Oh,
nice to see. We've got 1 minute
my Sunday
left.
morning. Yeah. So,
Um,
and yeah, thank you. The chat looks really a lot of you. Yeah. Yeah, I'm speaking to the choir here, aren't I, really? But I really recommend having a look at George Eliot's non-fictional prose. It's all been beautifully uploaded in both PDF, so you get the original, facsimile of the original publications on that George Eliot archive. They ask everyone to credit them when they use them, so I'm crediting them. It's free to use, and you start to work your way into a lot of these materials are now free and open access, so that we're going back to this sort of sense of self-education that we can now do through the digital.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's totally brilliant. We will send you the chat so you can read the whole
Lovely.
thing, but it's
Thank you.
mostly people saying, this is so interesting. This is amazing. I had no idea.
Great.
Kate's so clear. I want to go to her classes.
Oh no, I just chat.
Anyway,
Thank
thank you
you.
very
Well,
much,
thanks for
everybody, for
listening,
coming.
everybody.
And unfortunately, Kate can't come to the conference next week, but
Mm.
we will see you in the autumn, hopefully online, and for more of these fantastic webinars.
Yeah, and I'll see people at Filia if I don't see them next week. So
Oh,
at
brilliant. Yes, yes.
WCA.
Lots of us are going to be at Filia,
Oh,
so that would be
fantastic. Yeah,
amazing.
that's like a
Brilliant.
big party.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Brilliant. Okay, bye everybody. And
Okay,
thanks very much,
thank you
Kate.
very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.